The year was 1852. Thousands of families were crossing the United States in wooden wagons, guided by rusty compasses, fragile hopes, and promises of fertile lands in the far west. The Oregon Trail was a thin line between life and death, a corridor of mud, fever, hunger, and silence. But for some, the danger wasn't in the path. It was in the destination. Because in the middle of that vast wilderness, a solitary structure stood, Sacred Heart Chapel. Beautiful, unobtrusive, and deadly. The Grayson family story begins here. And not with screams, but with hymns. Not with guns, but with smiles. They didn't wait for victims. They waited for believers. The chapel was built by Morai Grayson, a soft-spoken man with perfectly combed hair and a Bible always at hand. It was said that he had left Missouri in search of peace after losing his wife to cholera. But there were holes in that story. No one knew his past. No one knew his lineage. What was known was what he showed himself to be, a charismatic spiritual leader who offered shelter, food, and prayer to any traveler in need. With him were his sister Constance, a skilled nurse who cared for the sick, and Ezekiel, the youngest brother, always silent, always in the shadows, always watching. The chapel was strategically located near a poorly mapped intersection between two alternate trail routes. Most travelers only stumbled upon it by accident, and that was exactly how the Graysons wanted it. Families were isolated, lost, and without support. Easy targets. The earliest accounts tell of a warm welcome, hot food, clean water, harmonious songs, and words of comfort. Most travelers thanked them and moved on. But not all. Some fell ill. Others disappeared. And others simply never made it to their destination. It was the Burns family, the Cotters, the Halloran brothers, and the McGinty's, an Irish merchant couple who brought with them silver coins, tools, and a small child. Later accounts from survivors of the trail say they were all last seen near the chapel area. None of them ever made it to Oregon. None of them left a trail. None of them were ever searched for, because back then no one investigated travelers. Disappearances were common. Losing someone along the way was part of the price. But for the Graysons, it was profit. The first concrete indication that something was wrong came from a man named Elijah Carter. He was traveling alone with a mule and refused to let the Graysons stay. He chose to camp a few miles from the chapel. That night, he wrote in his diary he heard distant chanting. Beautiful. Hypnotic. And then, abrupt silence. The next morning he returned to the chapel to give thanks, but no one answered. As he approached the shed, he heard muffled noises. He left, suspicious but without proof. His diary, found years later, was one of the first pieces in the puzzle. The Graysons were methodical. Constantia studied each visitor with a clinical eye. She offered teas and infusions. Some were medicinal, others not. Morai prayed at length with the sick, gained their trust, asked questions. Ezekiel watched over the wagon. He catalogued the belongings. He assessed their value. If the family was rich, sick, or isolated, they would not leave the chapel. The pattern repeated itself. Always under the guise of kindness. Always as an act of mercy. But it was a cult. A cult of the very idea of cleanliness. A moral selection where only the strong deserved to reach the West. A federal report later described the Graysons as ceremonial killers. But back then they were just a footnote. The trail's dead had no voice. Their names were rarely even recorded. The chapel, built with care, was seen as an oasis, even recommended by some travelers. That made the Graysons untouchable. Because faith, when well executed, blinds. And hospitality, when combined with faith, kills in silence. What no one knew was that the Graysons wrote down everything. Every death. Every stolen valuables. Every symptom. Every final prayer. They had a system. A gospel of their own. And over time they turned murder into a liturgy. But that's a topic for the next episode. The word benevolence carries a sacred glow. A value that crosses cultures, religions, and continents. It is the image of an altruistic gesture, of selfless help, of genuine compassion. But in the wrong hands, this same word can be the sharpest blade. Because nothing hides evil better than the appearance of kindness. And the Graysons knew this better than anyone. In this second episode, we will walk through the doors of the Chapel of the Sacred Heart and understand how a family built, with prayer, acceptance, and manipulation, the perfect trap. The Graysons presented themselves as a missionary community. Morai, the priest, had the gift of words. His sermon was simple, direct, and deeply emotional. He spoke of rest, of forgiveness, of new beginnings. He promised spiritual comfort to those who had lost children on the crossing. He offered food to those who had been fasting for days. He touched each hand firmly, looked into each person's eyes with sincerity, and knew exactly what to say to each type of traveler. There was no shouting. There were no threats. There was only peace. A peace that lulled the senses and opened the doors of trust. Constantia was the mother of faith. Her serene face hid the surgical precision of a pharmacist. She welcomed sick women, examined children, prepared poultices and infusions. Some really worked. Others caused weakness, dizziness, confusion. She said it was the purification process, that it was normal, that fever was a sign of healing, and many believed her, because she smiled, because she touched them gently, because she called each child by name and kissed their foreheads before putting them to sleep. No one suspected the woman who cared for them so well. As for Ezekiel, the servant, he was the most invisible. He carried firewood. He cleaned the stables. He offered water. His gaze was always downcast, his gestures slow, his voice almost absent. But he was the one who, in the dead of night, searched the wagons. He was the one who assessed the suitcases. He was the one who made notes in the diaries hidden under the basement floor. He was the accountant, the profit cartographer, the risk analyst. If the family was wealthy, vulnerable, and isolated, he would scratch a symbol on the door frame, and the process would begin. It all began with the invitation to worship. Morai led an informal mass, always at sunset. The pews in the chapel were rustic but clean. There were flowers. There were candles. There was soft music. He read passages from the Bible that spoke of death with beauty, of crossing to the other side with dignity, of not fearing eternal rest. Many wept. Many knelt. Many felt that they had finally found a safe place. It was there, in this moment of emotion, that the Graysons surrounded them with the armor of faith and completely disarmed them. Then came the rituals of restoration. A light dinner, tea to purify the body, prayers in low voices, and anointing with scented oil. It all seemed innocent. It all seemed holy. But the tea contained controlled extracts, small doses of poison, imperceptible in the short term but lethal over time. The anointing was used to disguise the smell of the acid sweat that began to appear with the first symptoms. And rest was the harbinger of death. For the weakest families, the end came in 2 or 3 days. For the most resilient, it took a week, always accompanied by spiritual consolation. Morai was at their bedside, praying, whispering verses, promising the kingdom of heaven. At the end, the bodies were buried with dignity in the vicinity of the chapel. Simple graves. No names. No crosses. Just earth and silence. What was left was collected, cataloged and stored in the basement. Coins, weapons, utensils, clothes. Everything was redistributed or sold at distant trading posts by other accomplices of the network. And no one suspected. Because everyone who left the chapel, the few who managed to, left enchanted. They spoke of a blessed mission. They recommended the place. And they perpetuated the myth of the benevolence of the Graysons. It was a trap that fed on the victim's own faith, a cycle that renewed itself. A perfect theater. But like every overstaged play, at some point someone sees the strings. And in the next episode we'll see when, and how, the first eyes began to see behind the veil. Faith was the disguise. Doctrine was the disguise. And the Bible, a tool of persuasion. In the 3rd episode of this macabre story, we enter the dark heart of what the Grayson family had become. Not just murderers, but evangelists of death. They didn't just kill. They preached before they killed. They consoled before they poisoned. And they buried with flowery sermons every soul they themselves had condemned. It was during this period, between late 1852 and early 1854, that the chapel stopped being a shelter and became a production line. Each new group of travelers that stopped was meticulously analyzed. Their faith, their possessions, their illnesses, their emotional fragility. Morai adjusted his sermon according to the denomination of the victim. For the Baptists, he spoke of salvation and eternal reunion. For the Presbyterians, he cited the divine plan and predestination. For the Methodists, he insisted on the healing power of prayer. Every line was rehearsed. Every pause was measured. Every tear was rehearsed to perfection. Sister Constantia perfected her formulas. She discovered that small doses of arsenic, diluted in communion wine, caused slow symptoms without raising suspicion. The poison could be introduced little by little into chamomile teas, hot soups or tinctures that she said were miraculous. Ezekiel, in turn, transformed his waking moments into opportunities to map out the family's assets. He knew where every object was. He sewed up the pockets where the gold was hidden. And he wrote everything down in coded notebooks hidden in secret compartments in the basement. In fact, the basement. Over time it stopped being just a warehouse. It was transformed into a laboratory, a morgue and a safe. There was a long table where the bodies were prepared. Shelves where the medicines were kept. A cabinet with dozens of bottles, papers and tools. And a trunk where the most valuable possessions were stored before being redistributed or sold to black market dealers. The logic was simple. If the Oregon Trail led people to the promised paradise, the chapel would be their last earthly stop. Morai said he helped these souls cross with dignity. The prayers he said at wakes were frighteningly cold. He spoke of heavenly peace as casually as he noted the number of silver spoons he had just acquired. Faith was the curtain. The poison was the thread that moved it. In one of the records found decades later, a note read, "Green family. 3 adults. 2 children. Started November 2nd. Finished November 17th. Revenue, $420. Lessons. Reduce exposure to children. Prefer tea to soup for elderly." It was a report of murder. Over time, the Graysons perfected a sort of gospel of their own. A moral code in which each death was justified by its usefulness. Morai's favorite phrase, repeated like a mantra, was, "The Lord distributes his gifts as he sees fit. We simply follow his order." In his twisted mind, he wasn't stealing. He was redistributing. He wasn't killing. He was guiding souls. And the weaker souls, he said, were a burden, not a blessing. In just over 2 years, it is estimated that more than 50 people were killed by this poison theology. The chapel became a legend among a few survivors who heard rumors or felt an inexplicable discomfort when passing by. But no one dared to accuse. After all, they were just rumors. And who would accuse a man of God? In the next few episodes, we will see how one survivor would change everything. But so far, everything was going according to the Graysons' plan. And the gospel of death was preached with fervor, one sermon at a time. Not everyone was seduced by Father Morai's calm voice. Not everyone drank the wine. This episode is about the few who felt that something was wrong. Who noticed the bitter smell behind the perfume of the flowers in the chapel. Who heard the sweet words and recognized in them the taste of fear. In 1854, the Weatherby family, originally from Tennessee, was part of a wagon train that broke up near the Blue Mountains. Charles Weatherby was a different man from most. A former Confederate officer, intelligent, suspicious. Traveling with his wife Margaret, their 15-year-old twin daughters, and his brother-in-law David, a blacksmith, the family took with them work tools, provisions, and a considerable amount of gold coins. When their wagon had trouble with the wheels, the usual thing happened. Ezekiel appeared among the bushes as always at the right moment. He offered help. He said there was shelter and water in the chapel. Morai welcomed them as brothers. Constance offered the girls tea and examined David, who had a fever. Within a few days the Weatherbys were in the ritual of trust. But Charles watched. He noticed how Ezekiel seemed more interested in the contents of the wagon than in helping. How Morai changed his tone when speaking to each member of the family. How the prayers were too long. And, most importantly, how Constantia insisted on administering her medicines out of sight. Margaret, however, already tired from the trip and worried about her brother-in-law, insisted that they stay. It was on the 4th day that Charles caught Ezekiel examining the secret compartments of the wagon. When confronted, his brother just smiled and said that he was protecting the family's belongings from wild animals. The excuse was good, but the trust was broken. Charles tried to convince his wife to leave, but David was already bedridden. And Margaret had the flu. Escape was impossible. One night, Charles searched the basement of the chapel and found something that chilled him to the bone. A doll that did not belong to his family. A brooch with initials that he did not recognize. A diary with dates prior to their presence there. And most seriously, a letter handwritten by an unknown woman, thanking the Grayson family for taking care of their sick children. A letter that was never sent. Charles tried to confront Morai. But that same night he was overcome by nausea and a violent weakness. The poison was already in his body. Weakened, he tried to warn his daughters. But his words were mistaken for delirium. Margaret died 3 days later. David 2 days after her. Charles agonized for another week. The twins were the last. But not all stories end in tragedy. Also in 1854, another family, the Pattersons, approached the chapel. And among them was Catherine, the patriarch's sister-in-law, an educated woman, the daughter of a pharmacist. Upon seeing Constantia's medicines, she noticed the white powder in the infusions. She asked questions. She received evasions. She pretended to take them. She convinced her nephew to do the same. When the others fell ill, she did not. In the dead of night, Catherine organized the escape. With the help of her sister-in-law Emily, who managed to distract Morai despite being poisoned, they struck Ezekiel with a tool and escaped in a wagon. For 3 days they wandered through the forest until they came across a military patrol. Catherine was carrying samples of the medicine, the white powder and the letter that had been found. Her complaint triggered the official investigation. But the Graysons had fled. The abandoned chapel hid the registry books, the grave maps and the catalog goods in its basement. Terror was coming to the surface. But justice would still take a while to catch up with them. It was the beginning of the end. But not for the victims. For the Graysons. The escape of the Patterson family in 1854 broke the cycle of silence that surrounded the chapel. Catherine, the only survivor fully aware of the horrors, became not only a witness, but a stubborn pursuer of the truth. Her lucidity, courage and meticulousness made the case impossible to keep quiet. In her hands were material evidence. The bottle with the white powder, the letters that were never delivered, the objects that clearly belonged to other families. And, above all, her living memory. Upon arriving at the Fort Dallas garrison, Catherine was initially disbelieved. The idea that a Christian family, considered benevolent and admired by some travelers, could have committed so many murders was difficult to accept. But the symptoms of Emily, the sick sister-in-law, were clear: poisoning. The samples collected revealed the presence of arsenic in lethal quantities. A detachment was sent to the Chapel of the Sacred Heart. They found it empty. Morai, Constantia, and Ezekiel had disappeared. But what was left behind was enough to prove the horror. Dozens of carefully handwritten records listed names, dates, methods, and profits. The details of each victim were there, as if they were accounting assets. An empire of death. Catherine, even shaken, participated in every step of the investigation. She identified objects, corrected dates, and helped investigators decipher the codes left in the books. She also recognized in a partially burned portrait the faces of the killers, and of a fourth figure, a young woman who had never been mentioned. Who was she? An accomplice? A daughter? Or another victim who had lived too long? Over the next few months, Catherine testified before courts, military councils, and journalists. She became the face of the prosecution. Meanwhile, the authorities began a nationwide manhunt. The name Grayson became synonymous with deceit and death. Notices were posted in churches, taverns, and trading posts. But the criminals had disappeared like smoke. For 2 years, nothing. No trace. No witnesses. Just echoes. Until, in 1857, California authorities warned of a new religious mission that had suddenly sprung up near the Oregon border. Their travelers were also disappearing. And the missionaries? A priest named Benedict, a sister named Mary, and a brother named Thomas. It was impossible to ignore the parallels. Catherine, upon hearing this, demanded to go there. The authorities refused. But her detailed description of the 3 criminals convinced the federal agents. A secret patrol was sent to observe the mission. And what they found was more than familiar. It was a copy, a continuation. The same pattern. The same words. The same death disguised as a blessing. The siege would be set with surgical precision. And justice at last was approaching. The Divine Mercy mission seemed like a blessing on the map of weary travelers. It had sprung up discreetly at a strategic point between Oregon and California, offering shelter, food, and prayer. 3 figures led the place: Father Benedict, Sister Mary, and Brother Thomas. New names. Same faces. The new incarnation of the Graysons. For weeks, a team of federal agents watched the mission. What they saw was a spectacle of déjà vu. The same ritual of reception. The same affable tone of voice. The same pattern of victims. Families with children traveling alone with visible assets and vulnerable health. But there was something new. A fourth element. A group of local men, accomplices, acting as intermediaries. Recruits for the new phase of the empire. The mission had evolved. The poison was now administered more quickly. Sister Mary had abandoned gradual doses and began using infusions that took effect within hours. This reduced the risk of suspicion and allowed for a quicker renewal of targets. Brother Thomas coordinated the logistics. Father Benedict, formerly Morai, led the rituals with his usual eloquence, now more mature, more refined, and more cynical. It was the arrival of the Henderson family that brought the operation to its decisive stage. Farmers from Missouri, the Hendersons traveled with 4 children and a wagon loaded with tools and coins. Welcomed with songs, installed in cabins next to the chapel and medicated from the first day, everything indicated that they would be just another number in the mission's ledger. But the agents were ready. When the youngest child suddenly fell ill after drinking a glass of milk offered by Thomas, the alarm was raised. At dawn on June 15, 1857, the mission was surrounded. Not a single Grayson escaped. What was found at the site surpassed the previous horror. There was a triple basement with storage chambers, disposal areas, and camouflaged safes. Personal effects from at least 20 families. Letters, photographs, diaries. And, again, the records. Hundreds of pages written by Benedict, describing murders with surgical precision. Profits, losses, methods, failures, and successes. A complete handbook of the second generation of the Grayson Empire. It was also in these files that the agents found something even more frightening: references to other groups. Mission of Penance in Arizona. Refuge of the Righteous in Utah. Small cells, possibly led by disciples of the original Graysons. Had the killers trained new devotees? Faith as a facade. Death as a doctrine. And expansion as a mission. In prison, Morai did not repent. He declared himself an instrument of divine justice. He said he eliminated the weak to strengthen the survivors. Constance remained silent. Ezekiel tried to cooperate, but nothing could lift the weight of his hands. There was still one unanswered question: the young woman in the portrait. The fourth figure. The record spoke of her as the seed. A new beginning. Perhaps a daughter. Perhaps just the next chapter of horror. Decades had passed since the siege of the Divine Mercy mission. The Grayson name had become the stuff of legend, fable, and nightmare, told around campfires by older travelers. Official records spoke of the end of a murderous cult. Newspapers had stopped their headlines. Catherine Patterson, aging, lived in seclusion. And even federal archives began to be sealed and forgotten. But the story was not over. In 1903, during the construction of an industrial railroad expansion, workers unearthed something in the basement of the old Sacred Heart Chapel, which had been consumed by roots and vines over the years. What appeared to be mere ruins revealed a completely sealed compartment. Inside were objects that had never been recorded by investigators. A new diary, photographs, a ritual robe, and most disturbing, an oil painting of a young woman with her eyes closed, holding a chalice. She was the fourth figure. Federal historians spent months cataloging the material. The diary revealed a more recent, more elaborate, and more fanatical language. It spoke of continuity, of a planted seed, of preserved blood. "I am the heir of judgment," one passage said. And another, even more disturbing: "The world forgets, but blood remembers." From this discovery, rumors began to spread. In small towns in the interior of California, groups with alternative faith practices began to appear, led by an austere and rarely seen female figure. Reports spoke of miraculous cures, but also of disappearances. Old posters from the time of the siege of the mission were compared. And in at least two of them, an unidentified female face matched the portrait found. The most widely accepted theory among modern investigators is that Constantia, before her capture, had left her daughter hidden, raised by accomplices, prepared for the succession, and trained not only as a nurse but as an indoctrinator. The writings called this woman the bearer. Nothing was ever proven. But in 1921, a fire destroyed a federal archive in Sacramento that held the Sacred Heart Chapel records. The case was briefly reopened, only to be shelved again for lack of evidence. Today, the records about the Graysons are considered sensitive historical documents. Some pages have never been released. Others, it is said, have disappeared. And some claim that the carrier lived until the 1940s, operating small religious clinics in the American South under different identities. Names like Anna Grace, Clara Benedict, and Miriam Thomas appear frequently in unofficial reports. What is buried lives on. Faith can be the most powerful of lights, or the deepest of shadows. And when used to justify horror, it leaves scars that time cannot erase. The Grayson story is not just about death. It is about how evil can dress up in virtue, smile like a shepherd, embrace like a mother, and still taste like poison. And maybe, somewhere, it still continues.